Hi everyone, welcome to 2.1 Growing the Business. This is the first video in Theme 2. There's going to be 5 of these. If you haven't seen the other ones, there's going to be one for each of the different sections of Theme 2. So 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5. It's going to be a brief revision video. Not quite sure how long it's going to be until we kind of get to the end, but I'm going to put some notes up on the screen as we go through. I'm going to talk around those notes. Certainly some suggestions. I would say grab a pen and paper and maybe write down the notes as we go, add in some bits of detail, especially focusing on the bits that you're not sure on. And hopefully this will be a useful part of revision for you. So 2.1, the start of Theme 2, starts the transition away from looking at the small businesses that are studied in Theme 1 and starting to look at the bigger businesses in Theme 2. So the first sort of section of this is all about growth of a business and some of the potential positives of growth and some of the kind of shortfalls and the problems that affect businesses that are growing. So the first step in 2.1.1 business growth is looking at methods of growth. And we've got 2 different categories of methods of growth. We've got internal growth, which is also known as organic growth. And we've got external growth, which is also known as inorganic growth. So I'd like to first of all apologize for any handwriting. It was just the much easier way to do this was to just write the notes on. So I apologize if you can't read my writing. Hopefully you can understand my voice, and then it'll make sure you get kind of all the information you need. So we'll start with internal. So internal growth is where a business grows through its own operations, just expansion, general expansion really. So that could be launching new products, so launching a new product range through innovations, for example. It could be through new inventions, making up new products. It could be improving existing products. But that's just where a business generally grows by just continuing to do what they were doing in the first place. The other version of this, of course, is expansion through locations, maybe opening new stores, whether that's in one country or whether that's international. We're going to touch a little bit more on the international side of things a little bit later on. But our internal growth is the growth that comes from within. So it's just us as a business continuing to do what we are doing. External is a bit different. External is through a merger or a takeover. And so effectively it involves another business outside of our own. So a merger, for example, would be 2 businesses deciding to combine into one new business. We've seen some really, really good examples of this, such as one of the most prominent ones is the merger between T-Mobile and Orange to create EE. That would be an example of 2 businesses deciding to merge together to become one new business. Typically, the new business starts with its own brand identity. For example, EE as a brand didn't exist before. It was Orange and T-Mobile, and they decided to combine. There are some examples of mergers that decide to maintain the original branding, maybe because they've got a lot of loyalty or something like that. A takeover is a little bit different to a merger. A merger is where 2 businesses come together to form one new business. A takeover is where one business buys another business. And so in that situation, the business that is the business that is taking over the other business will be the one that remains, and then the business that's being taken over will become part of that business. Now, there's benefits and drawbacks to both of these. Internal, you have a bit more control over it because it's what you are doing, and sort of you can make all of the decisions around that. However, it is obviously going to be slower. External is going to be much, much quicker because you might be merging with or buying an existing business that has a lot of brand loyalty and brand identity and a lot of operations already set up. However, it is often much more expensive because when you're taking over a business, you have to buy it not just for its value now, but for its potential value in the future. So a really good example of this would be if you go back to 2011, 2012, Facebook buying Instagram. They paid $1 billion for Instagram. It wasn't all up in cash. Some of it was in Facebook shares. But you weren't just paying the $1 billion for the value of Instagram at that point. You were paying the $1 billion, which to be honest was more than Instagram was worth at the time, for the potential future value of Instagram. And I think if you look back, you'll say that was a very, very good decision. So that's our methods of growth in terms of internal and external. In terms of sources of finance, because obviously growth isn't cheap, it costs a lot of money, we also have internal and external sources of finance. So our internal sources of finance, that would be things like the owner's funds. So again, internal comes from within our business. So the owner's funds, like if the owner puts some more money into the business, that's obviously internal. Retained profit, which is the term given to profit that a business has made from previous years. Now, the big benefit of that, of course, is you don't have to pay anyone back because it's money you already have. So that's ideally, if a business is making profit, that's one of the best uses, one of the best sources of finance. And also potentially sale of assets, which is where if you have something, an asset is something a business owns, that is no longer needed, you might sell that to fund other ventures. So for example, a piece of land or a building or a piece of machinery or a vehicle or something like that, that is no longer being used or is no longer being used effectively, you might choose to sell that and then use that money to buy something else. Of course, the downside of that is you lose whatever the asset is, but you would like to think that businesses are only making that decision if it's an asset they can afford to lose. In terms of external sources of finance, we're going to look at two main categories here. We're going to look at share capital. So share capital is where you sell a share of the business ownership to an investor. We'll talk a little bit more about the different methods of this in terms of whether it's through a private limited company or a public limited company. A private limited company is one where you can sell shares in that business, but only to a private agreement. So not anyone can buy a share in that business. It has to be an agreement between the owner of the shares and the owner of the business and the person who's looking to invest. A public limited company, this is typically, when we think about 2.1, we start to see businesses getting bigger. A public limited company is where a business sells their shares on the stock market, the stock exchange. And so that involves if it's the first time, an IPO, which is an initial public offering, which is the first time a business offers their shares to the stock market. And then they might get investors from anywhere. They can get investors from all over the place. So typically, public limited company, if your business has got real potential and a good brand image, you might find it much easier to get investment. But there is obviously the risk that you are allowing investors into your business that maybe don't have the same vision for the company that you have. And you have to involve them in decision making, certainly depending on how much of a share they've got. But you will be making decisions for their benefit, of course, if they're part owners of the business. So that's share capital. The other is loan capital, and we've got two types of loan capital. We've got an overdraft and we've got a bank loan. You're probably familiar more so with the bank loan. A bank loan is obviously where you borrow a sum of money and you pay it back over a period of time. That's obviously always agreed. You agree it with the bank how long you are going to repay the loan back in, and they'll also calculate interest as well. And so that interest rate means you pay that back on top of the original loan amount. So the higher the interest rate, the more you will have to pay back on top of the loan. An overdraft it's not quite the same as a loan. It is a form of a loan, but it's not really the same. It doesn't work in the same way. An overdraft is where you can go into a negative bank balance for a short period of time. Now, the one difference between an overdraft and a bank loan is each time you get a bank loan, you have to apply for that at a separate time, whereas an overdraft, you apply for it once, and once you've got that overdraft, you're free to use it as often or as little as you'd like. So, for example, if I have a business and I have an overdraft of £5,000, that means I can spend up to minus £5,000 bank balance, and I don't have to apply for that. It's just once I've got that limit there, that's how much I can spend. There are usually charges for going into your overdraft, and there are certainly high levels of interest if you don't pay it back within a certain period of time. But it can be really useful in the short term if you have a cost that you need to pay and you can't quite afford to pay it, or you need some supplies, you need to buy them. You can use your overdraft to pay for them now in the hope that you're going to get some money back a little while later and pay it back. So again, worth emphasizing there, the overdraft is the short-term source of finance. I know that when overdrafts are mentioned, you want to see an answer that suggests something about it being short-term, and also that there's interest involved as well. So that's 2.1.1. 2.1.2, we start to see when a business grows that their objectives and their aims change. So the first thing is worth explaining what an aim and an objective is. An aim is the long-term goal for the business, so it's what the business wants to achieve overall. An objective is the targets that help them get there. So to think like a personal example, if my aim was to run a marathon, I can't just go and run a marathon just like that. Like, I'd have to do a lot of preparing and a lot of training. So I might set myself objectives that might help me get there. So my first objective might be to run 5K twice a week for a period of time. I might then bump that up to 10K. I might bump that up to 15K. I might then put some time limits in and say I want to be able to do it by X amount of minutes. And then you build it up. And the idea is that by meeting the objectives, by meeting the targets, you become closer to meeting your aims. Now, in terms of a business, we've got to think about two areas to this, like why do aims and objectives change, and how do aims and objectives change. So let's start with the why. Our objectives are going to change down because of our situation, and usually this is going to be in a response to a number of different factors. So I've put a list of factors there on the screen. So let's think about the first one, market conditions. If you're in a really competitive market, perhaps a new competitor has joined, or perhaps the market has grown quite rapidly, you might change your aims and objectives to compensate. If you are joined in the market by a really, really strong competitor, Your objective might be just to kind of consolidate and maintain your position. If you feel like you've got a massive advantage, you might look to try and kind of grow and maximize your profits. Technology can have a huge impact on business. That's a running theme throughout this entire course, the impact of technology. And so if technology comes in that is a benefit to us, we might change and be a bit more ambitious. If technology that we are using becomes out of date, perhaps, or competitors or other businesses have got technology that's better than ours, we might again have to readdress our aims and objectives to be a little bit more cautious. Our performance is definitely going to have a big impact. A really good example of this is Tesco. Tesco's performance over the last sort of 10 years in the face of, again, market conditions from Aldi and Lidl has meant that they've had to change their aims and objectives to try and compete in a market in a bit of a different way to how they were doing before because they weren't doing very well. Legislation can have a huge impact as well. New law comes in and it might mean that a certain avenue of the business is no longer able to happen. So you might have to pivot, you might have to try a different strategy. Anything like that. Obviously, sometimes legislation can be a positive thing, but it definitely will change aims and objectives of a business. And then internal reasons. And it's a vague topic, but it could be things like, for example, a new leader comes in or a new owner comes in and they want to change the way the business works. And so they might set different aims and objectives. So how do they change? We know why they change. How do they change? Well, originally, we'd say that for a small business, their focus is going to be on survival in the first, certainly 12 to 24 months. When you start a new business, you don't have a huge reputation. You don't have a loyal base of customers. Your priority is going to be just surviving for a period of time. As time goes on, you should hopefully be able to start growing your business. And so we should hopefully be able to move from survival into growth. And certainly as we're growing the business, the entire unit's called growing the business, we should be able to focus a little bit more on that growth. Growth of sales, growth of profits, things like that. We might decide to enter and exit markets. Naturally, if we're growing, we'd like to enter more markets than we're exiting. But it is worth saying that, if a market isn't going particularly well, it might be the sensible decision to leave the market. You might decide that actually, and we talked about technology before, but if technology means that a market isn't viable anymore, it's been replaced, your best option is to exit it. So that would obviously result in a change in aims and objectives. And then there's some decisions that we might make to help us do this. For example, by growing or reducing our workforce. Growing our workforce means hiring new staff. Reducing our workforce might mean cutting some costs by removing some staff, getting rid of some staff or making them redundant. So that, again, would be dependent on what we are responding to and whether it's a positive or a negative. So not a huge amount there in terms of real terminology or new key terminology, but really important concepts that are worth bearing in mind, especially when you're looking at a case study, because you'll be able to see from the case study any examples of whether businesses are doing those things. Next, we move on to 2.1.3, globalization. This is where we really start to talk about business growth, because now we're starting to look beyond just the country that we're operating in. We might start looking at other countries. So the first is the impact of globalization. We've got a few key terms to introduce here. We didn't have as many in 2.1.2. We've definitely got some key terms worth paying attention to here. So the first is thinking about the difference between imports and exports. So I've put a little map of the UK in the middle there. Hopefully that makes it a bit easier to understand. But an import is where we bring something in from abroad. So perhaps we're buying materials from a different country. Perhaps we're buying finished products from a different country. But if we buy something from abroad and bring it into the UK, we are importing it to the UK. And then we also have exports on the other side. And so exports is where we sell to abroad. Now, it's worth mentioning already at this point, and this is going to be a little bit of a throw to the 1.5 video, which mentions the economy. When we're thinking about imports and exports, we're probably thinking about exchange rates. And so if we're thinking about exchange rates, we should really be thinking about spiced, strong pound, imports cheaper, exports dearer. The terms imports and exports are used in that. So it's definitely worth thinking about that. And the idea behind this is obviously understanding that as a business, we are hopefully being able to sell to abroad. And we talked earlier about entering markets. Well, entering markets could be entering new countries, but we're also potentially going to be relying on products or materials from other countries as well. Now, what this leads to is a multinational company. And a multinational company is a company, as you can probably guess, that operates in different locations. So the whole impact of globalization is understanding how much of an impact buying and selling to and from abroad has on businesses in the UK or anywhere, and understanding that as businesses grow, this might be an area that they might look to kind of take advantage of. We also have the the understanding that we might actually change locations, and that might mean entering new markets and exiting old markets. There's going to be a variety of different factors to that, whether the market is growing, whether there's a lot of competition in the market, but it's just worth bearing in mind that actually as a business grows, they might decide to take advantage of favorable conditions in other countries. So for example, I'm willing to bet that if you look at an item of clothing that you're wearing and you look at where it was manufactured, it's definitely not going to have been in the UK, and that's because we've seen a lot of our manufacturers, and certainly in the clothing industry and other industries, move to places like the Far East, looking at Asia, where they can take advantage of lower cost labor and lower living costs, which allows them to pay their workers less, which in turn allows them to charge cheaper prices to customers and be able to make more sales. In terms of competing globally, there's a few other things that are worth bearing in mind. A multinational company is one that operates in different locations. Those operations could be things like a factory, could be a physical store. But of course, because of the internet and because of e-commerce, you are able to compete globally even just from one location. You could manufacture something in your garage and sell it online to people of different countries. I know that these videos, for example, reach across the world to people who are studying the English exam boards at international schools in places all over the world. I know that some of the videos we did for the A-level, which you can keep an eye on next year if you do an A-level business, have gone as far as, South America and Brazil and places like that. So e-commerce and that communication and the instant access to all this has allowed businesses to be able to compete globally really, really easily. It's also worth bearing in mind, though, that, of course, when a business does move to a different country and sell in a different country, they might have to adapt their marketing mix to match what the other country is looking for. So we're going to talk more about the marketing mix a little bit later on when we get into the marketing unit in one of the other videos. But obviously, naturally, because of differences between societies, differences between cultures, there's going to be differences in the marketing mix for, businesses trying to target different countries. In terms of barriers to trade, there are a few. The main two key terms are tariffs and quotas. So a tariff is a tax on imports. So if you bring something into the UK, depending on the trade agreement between our country and the country that we're buying it from, we may face a tax. And that effectively is a sum of money that goes to the government. And that is just kind of their reward for allowing things to be bought in from different countries. We also have limits on these as well. So a quota is a limit on imports. So, for example, the UK might have a limit on the amount of Japanese cars that we bring in. The reason behind that would be if we put a limit on the amount of Japanese cars that are brought in, that means that people in the UK, customers in the UK, have to look elsewhere for their cars. So they might look at British-based cars. And so there's a benefit to the UK economy of having that, because it means that if the car is manufactured in Britain, it means people in Britain were paid to manufacture that car. It means more of the money was put into our economy through wages and things like that. Now, in terms of barriers to trade, obviously there's a lot of sense for a business to operate in a country that doesn't have as many of those barriers to trade. So they might quite often join a trade bloc. So a trade bloc is an organization, a group of countries that have regional free trade. So they have a regional agreement where within that area, that trade bloc area, that trading area, they don't have tariffs and quotas. So the European Union is the best example of that. There are obviously plenty of others. They're usually geographically proximate. So there's one in North America, there's one in South America, Africa, and then you've got like an Asia, Australasia kind of one as well. The European Union, of course, really important one from our perspective because we were a member of it and are no longer. And so the impact of that is that we might have tariffs and quotas on certain goods because we don't have the same agreement that we had prior to Brexit. The last topic in 2.1 is 2.1.4, ethics and the environment. And the key thing here is understanding what ethics are. So ethics are doing the right thing. Now, there's loads of examples of this. So there's fair treatment of stakeholders. So all of the different people within our organization, we did stakeholders in theme 1. For example, our suppliers, our customers, our employees, if we treat them fairly, that's obviously good ethics. That's doing the right thing, even if it might cost us a little bit more money. We'll come back to that in a second. The impact on the community that we have, for example, through pollution, through noise, through disruption, the impact that we have on our community has to be a good impact, a positive impact. Using ethical suppliers, kind of a link to fair treatment of stakeholders to a degree because a supplier is a stakeholder, so is the community. But when it comes to using ethical suppliers, we mean using suppliers for materials that don't harmfully impact on the environment, that don't test on animals, that don't use like child labor and things like that. So using ethical suppliers is also doing the right thing. Now, in terms of the environment, I haven't added the environment to the previous one because although it would be part of ethics, it has its own section. So for the environment, we're looking at things like sustainability. So that is using resources that are considered renewable. So rather than using kind of minerals that are mined up from the ground or oils and things like that, which there's a finite amount and we will one day run out of them, we can use sustainable resources. So this is moving away from plastics and moving towards kind of wood, where we can obviously grow more wood, we can grow more trees. However, obviously, the more sustainable use of trees we use, the more we contribute to deforestation. And deforestation has a huge range of impacts. It has an impact on habitats for animals. And the big problem, of course, with deforestation is we're not necessarily planting trees as fast as we're cutting them down. So we are ruining our own sustainability by taking away more of these than we're adding. Obviously, use of plastics and the impact that they have, not just in terms of production, but also in terms of waste and the length of time it takes for plastic to degrade, means that it can be hanging around for a long time. It's obviously a big contributor towards litter. And so there's a big push. You'll have seen obviously a big push towards recycling to try and kind of make use of plastics and multi-use plastics and what have you. And then finally, in the environment, we've got emissions and pollution. And emissions, obviously, we think about emissions, we think about things like cars and travel and things like that. Pollution can be a bit broader a term. So pollution involves those things as well, like waste, for example, but also includes things like light pollution and noise pollution. So, for example, a nightclub is a business. And if there's a nightclub that opens next door to your house and it's open until 3 o'clock in the morning and it's just like got drum and bass coming through your window, like that's pollution. It's noise pollution, it's still pollution. So all of those things that we can do to our environment to potentially, hopefully, help make it sustainable. What this typically all leads to is this trade-off between ethics and profit. And the reality of the situation is that doing the right thing is often more expensive. And so a business quite often has to sacrifice some of their profit because they increase their costs by doing all of these ethical things. And so businesses have decisions to make. And a lot of businesses choose the profits and don't really do the ethical things that they probably should do because either they can't afford to do it or it impacts on their profits too much. On the other hand, you could argue that being ethical might allow you to charge a higher price. It's a source of added value if your products are ethical. And so that might mean that you can actually charge a little bit of a higher price and maybe not lose out on the profit. However, of course, most people, a lot of society, if they've got the choice between an ethically sourced chocolate bar and a cheaper chocolate bar, might choose the cheaper one. So because we all have our own kind of priorities and we all have our own needs and our own levels of income. So we all have to make our own decisions. But that trade-off of ethics and profit, if you think about all the things we've talked about in terms of ethics, how many of them are more expensive? And so that has a huge impact. The last part of 2.1.4 is the impact of pressure groups. So let's start with what a pressure group is. Now, a pressure group is an organization that encourages and pressures change from either a business or, in some cases, the government. So, for example, things like Greenpeace, Amnesty International, Just Stop Oil, they're all examples of pressure groups. Just Stop Oil in particular is one that has had it's produced a lot of pressure, really, which is the point of it. Now, think about the impact of this. Is if a pressure group is saying to your business that you're not doing things ethically, if they're saying to your customers that you're not doing things ethically, that's going to have a huge impact on the brand reputation of the business. And so naturally, it's of course important that businesses respond well to pressure groups and make sure that they show their stakeholders and their customers that they are making positive changes. So hopefully you found that useful. There's plenty more of these on the YouTube channel, so make sure you subscribe and keep an eye out on those. And if you've got any questions about any of the content specifically, put it down in the comments. I have attached in here in the description a link to a kind of blank version of this that you can print out if you want to fill in, so that you can kind of make some notes as you're going, especially on the things that you might not be so sure on. Thank you very much.